I always wanted to be a cowboy all my life, and I started working on the racetrack. That was the first horse job I had, and I worked there for about 6 or 7 years. Ran into some friends from there, and we started rodeoing, and I got into that. I did that for several years. I was kind of a late bloomer with music. I'd been kind of playing all my life and writing songs, but I didn't really start performing till I was in my 30s. And then in the late 80s, I started competitive carving was completely wrapped up in that for about 10 years. And it was just by a complete accident I stumbled over these cowboy poetry gatherings. An old friend of mine, a cowboy friend, had been invited to this gathering in Brandon, Manitoba, and he asked me why don't I come down and sing a couple of these songs. So I did. And it was the first time I was able to sing my original cowboy songs to an audience that not only appreciated it, but knew what I was talking about. You know, so I got hooked on it. My musical influences are very varied. I mean, and I'm not one of these guys that sticks to a specific style or genre, like that cowboy music has to be like, you know, like Wilf Carter or Ian Tyson or whatever. I just let any musical influences I have leak in, and this is kind of, this finger-picking style is kind of my comfort zone. The subject matter is cowboy, but the musical influences come from anywhere pretty well. And I've heard poets make statements about things, environmental statements or statements about different cultures that kind of go against the rural. Most of them kind of have a bit of a disdain for like city life and that kind of thing, and but mostly they're pretty forgiving. And I find most cowboy poetry is a kind of an interesting mix of tragedy and humor. Like there's somebody once said that the humor is tragedy plus time. And I think that describes a lot of cowboy poetry. And my poetry is much like that, a lot of it. Some of it's more thought-provoking and so on, but my songs tend to be like sad, kind of, well, you know, and cowboys as a general rule are kind of misfits, and they sometimes they have trouble with relationships, and they have trouble with fitting into society, and so a lot of it's that's what comes out in the poetry and the song, and so it's a kind of a mix of circumstances, really, I think.
How long have you known Doc Hayes?
Just about 10 years exactly. He's the very first cowboy poetry gathering I went to was one he put on here in Brandon, and that was 10 years ago. So.
Were you invited?
No. Actually, Len Carroll phoned me up, because I've known Len for like 50 years, and Len Carroll phoned me up and said he was invited and he didn't want to go by himself. And I'd written a bunch of cowboy songs at that time. I had never written a poem. I had, but not specifically a cowboy poem. So I thought, okay, I'll go with you. And I sang a couple of songs, and I ended up thinking, well, it's a poetry gathering. Maybe I should write a couple of poems. So I wrote that Re-Ride Pen poem, and I wrote one called Procrastination and one other one. And it all went over really well, and Doc kind of put me to work and we've been friends ever since, and I started going to the other gatherings. It was like the perfect
stage for me to do what I had written. I played for years in bands, touring around the country and playing bars, and of course that's all covered stuff, and you pull out an original tune and they're liable to throw beer bottles at you. So it was just like, I didn't even know this existed, you know, this format, and it seems to be a good fit for me. And there's a lot of puns and there's also a lot of references that people not might understand, like he's more than just a diamond on a pack of lies. Well, a diamond is the diamond hitch that they use on pack horses. So it's kind of these, and and heading off destruction, healing a bump steer. Well, heading and healing are what you do if you got to rope something to treat it in a pasture, or there's also a rodeo event called team roping where they do that. So there's all these kind of things that might go by a person who's not familiar with the language, you know. And like I said, I will go to like Pincher Creek or Maple Creek or any of these gatherings, and I'll know just about everybody there. And I have places all along the eastern slopes where I can stay. And this is after 10 years only of doing this. I mean, and it's the kind of place where they'll say, if we're not home, you know where the key is, you know. They have a real appreciation for the cowboy lifestyle. And it goes all the way from appreciating the old timers to up to modern day rodeo or ranching activities that are going on today and that kind of thing. And the thing is, it's usually older people because it is an older person's thing. And I think the reason for that is because you got to live a bunch of stuff before you can write that. Like you can't, if you're 15 years old, you haven't got a lot to draw on yet. So those people aren't writing poetry. They're doing the stuff that they'll write about later. And people say, where are the new poets going to come from? Well, they're not writing poetry now. They're out there riding leases and rodeo and stuff, and they'll write about it when they quit. Well, the way I've heard the origins of cowboy poetry, and even the music, a lot of the music, if somebody happened to have an instrument or something along. But on the big cattle drives back in the 1880s and so on, where they moved cattle like 2,000 miles. I mean, this is a full-time job, and you get to a town every 3 months or something. So basically what you're doing is you're sitting around the fire in the evening, and people would tell stories, and they would sing maybe, some of them. And the thing about the storytelling, I think they rhymed the stories often so they could be easier to remember. And it is true that it's easier to remember a story that's rhyming than if it isn't. And I've heard that as part of but it's morphed into other things too, like like anything else, it grows in its. But that's what I heard the original. And I like singing often in the old days when they'd have a guy riding out at night, guarding the herd. He'd sing so that he didn't spook the cattle, like. So they'd know where he was all the time, and so they'd sing these repetitious songs. That's why a lot of the cowboy songs are just 1,500 verses, you know, and there's really no chorus or structure, but they just and then of course they learn a song, and then they didn't have iPods and stuff, so yeah. So they'd heard it, but they'd forget half the lyrics, so they make up some of their own, and some of the cowboy poems, there's so many different versions of them, and sometimes you'll hear a person doing one that you know, and you know where you've heard it before, but they're like 2/3 of the way through the poem before you even know it's the same poem, because it's been changed so much depending on where they heard it and also what they added to it. It's kind of a growing thing. Now, Dick Winters is one of them guys who's kind of an inventive type of an individual, and he likes to, one of his favorite things is to look at a piece of equipment that's already in existence and say, I can improve on that. I'll rearrange stuff so that it'll work a lot better. And now, I should explain at this point that Dick is one of them guys that when he comes up with an idea, it's the finished product. Like there's no editing or thinking it through. I don't know how many times we've been working on something and I'll say to Dick, I'll say, before you strike that weld, maybe we should give this a little thought. And he just says to me, Ed, you think too much. It's one of his favorite comments to me. Ed, you think too much. Now, I should point out here that the most used piece of equipment, the second most used piece of equipment on our place is the welder. And the most used piece of equipment is the cutting torch. That's to cut all the stuff we shouldn't have welded in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that you can't get yourself into a lot of trouble by thinking too much. You take the time when after some careful study and deep pondering, I arrived in my mind at a question. And that question was, what if there is no such thing as ultimate reality? Now, if you want to get yourself into a lot of trouble, you just try sharing an idea like that with the wrong people. It's kind of like when you're a kid in school and you got this burning desire to be a cowboy and you make the mistake of sharing that ambition with your teacher. When I was in school, it seemed they were only trying to teach us one thing, and that is that if you work hard or study and knuckle down and everything and get a good education, you won't have to work. And the way they'd enforce this doctrine is if they caught you goofing off, and not paying attention, not that that ever happened to me, but I noticed in others, if they caught you doing this, they would threaten you with manual labor. They'd say something like, if you don't knuckle down and get a good education, you're going to be digging ditches all your life. Well, it seems to me that they can't use that anymore because nowadays nobody digs ditches. At least if they do, they're using a backhoe, and any kid would love to have a job like that. Nowadays they've changed it into rather than use the stick, they're using the carrot, and they're saying if you stay in school and get a good education, you'll make lots of money. And if you make enough money and get wealthy enough, you'll have leisure time. And you'll be able to spend that leisure time doing manual labor to keep yourself physically fit. Hell, if you make enough money and get wealthy enough, you might even be able to afford to have enough leisure time to spend your leisure time playing at being a cowboy. Which is kind of ironic. And that brings us right back around to the question, is there any such thing as reality? See, I think that which we perceive as reality is really nothing more than a collection of illusions that we've gathered from various places over time, and that's not really a problem except for the fact that the illusions of one person will differ considerably from those of another. And so when it comes time for you to create your own little special version of reality, you have some decisions to make. First of all, you have to decide whose illusions you're going to include in your version of reality. And then if you should happen to be indecisive, like I sometimes am, before you can decide whose illusions you're going to include in your version of reality, first of all, you have to decide if the decision to decide was properly decided in the first place. So you can see where it can get right out of hand. It kind of puts me in mind of something a friend of mine once said to me. He said, I used to think I was indecisive. Now I'm not so sure. So is growing old the thing I fear, or just that dying's the only cure? For you see, it would now seem I can't die. You ask why? It's plenty clear to me. How could I experience death if I no longer be? Now, if you're confused, I once was too, but there's really nothing to it. See, in order to perceive my death, Wouldn't I have to be alive to do it? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Dick was probably right. Maybe I do think too much. But before you come to a firm decision on that, let me ask you this. Have you ever watched a movie Cowboy as he makes his graceful ride off into the sunset? Now, there's something that I've tried. You know, all you get to do is ride along until the sun goes down. Then all it is dark and a long ride back to town. Now, I refuse to decide to worry about that which is to come, and somehow worrying about that which ain't seems a little dumb. Putting it still another way, what would happen if I were to, say, lose sleep while pondering, if not sleeping, as a plan that would improve my understanding of all the woes of man? And then what would happen if that lack of sleep should affect my memory? You know, I really wouldn't care. You see, indecisiveness and memory loss could make a dandy pair. If I can't decide to remember, or remember to decide, could it not be on that final day I'll have forgotten that I died? Of course, if I should happen to remember, I suppose that would mean I hadn't died at all. And dying something, I sure won't miss deciding to recall. I know the moral of this tale may be hard to see, but illusions are important, and as important as they be, if you have a real special one that's been helping you get through, don't waste your time looking for the truth. Believe me, that truth is not for you. Just study this vast universe. You'll come to it by and by. Illusions are the stars, the truth, but empty sky. I read something on it was on a coaster at a friend of mine's place down by Diamond City, Alberta. He had a coaster in his living room, and it read, "The time you spend on the back of a horse doesn't come off your life." And I kind of like that sentiment. It did occur to me, though, as I thought about it, that it kind of would depend on the kind of horses you're getting on, but I still like the sentiment. And that was the inspiration for this song. We just call it Riding. Riding in the sunshine, riding in the rain. Anytime you call on me, I'll go. Under that blazing summer sun, or through the winter snow, just run my horse beneath me and I'll go. Driving down the highway, or flying through the sky, faster ways to get there, this I know. But be your destination simply peace of mind, then riding is the only way to go. I've heard all the promises, I've heard all the lies. It took me some hard miles to finally realize there's no end to heartache to haunt me every day. And when I'm riding, it all goes away. Riding in the sunshine, riding in the rain. Just come a-calling and I'll go. other answer. It's not that I don't care. There's just nothing more I really need to know. I've rode in the mountains and I've rode across the plains. I've rode in arenas, it's always been the same. There's no end to misery, I see it every day. But when I'm riding, it all goes away. Riding in the sunshine, or riding in the rain. When I'm riding, it all goes away. People often ask me why I don't write love songs. Actually, I do write love songs. It's just that they're not exactly the kind of love songs that maybe people expect to hear. And you see, it's been my experience that love affairs or anything of that things of that type, they almost always end badly. And in fact, they always end badly. I mean, even if you fall in love with somebody and live happily for 50 years, eventually one of you has to die and the other one's got to be brokenhearted. I mean, there's just no good way for it to end. And there are two basic ways that a relationship can end. You can be the dumper or you can be the dumpee. You know, I'm usually the dumpee, but this song is about one time that I was the dumper. One of the few times I got to be the dumper, kind of it was a preemptive strike, you might say. Now, before I do this song, I'd like to tell you a few of the things I've learned about relationships in all my years. One of the most important things is that women do not operate from the same dictionary as us guys do. Now, as an example of this, if the woman you're with starts acting a little strangely and you ask her, so what's the matter? And she says, nothing. Now, I know you might think that means nothing, but actually what it means is, you're in big trouble, mister, and it's up to you to figure out why. And then, of course, there are those questions to which there is no right answer, such as, do I look fat? Do I look old? Where the hell have you been all night? But you know, I think the most important word that you have to understand the meaning of from a woman's point of view is the word compromise. Now, I looked it up in a dictionary and it says compromise. Agreement through arbitration and mutual concession. Makes sense to me. You give and take a little bit and meet in the middle. But when a woman says compromise, it goes more like this. It's like if she wants to do something and you want to do something else, you compromise and you do what she wants to do. Now, long before I had ever learned the fine art of compromise, I wrote this song, and it's about what happens when you don't compromise. It's called Darlin', I'll Be Leaving Now. Well, I've reached a line that I won't cross. I suppose it's just a question of who's going to be boss. And if you won't step up to it, I'll just pack up and go. I may not be much, but I ain't half bad. Hell, I'm probably the best you ever had. And there's one other little thing I think you ought to know. That if you ain't the best I ever did know, I never did once hesitate to show you off to anyone, including the best of my friends. Well, I ain't perfect, you understand, but if you can't accept me for what I am, I guess this relationship has come to an end. So darling, I'll be leaving now. I would have made you happy if I just knew how. The time is past for trying, ain't no use to crying, 'cause darling, I'm leaving now. Well, if it's a crime to play the guitar, I guess it's also wrong to go down to the bar and have a drink all by myself from time to time. And if all these things I do are so damn bad, I guess this song will really make you mad, and my leaving should make you feel just fine. I know all good things must come to an end, and no, I won't be saying can we still be friends, but I expect that's something you already knew. It's true I'll sometimes miss your smile, and I hope you think about me once in a while when you're lying in that big old bed with God knows who. So darling, I'll be leaving now. I would have made you happy if I just knew how. The time is past for trying, ain't no use you crying, 'cause darling, I'm leaving now. Well, I wish you luck, and I hope you find yourself some jerk with a simple mind and a masochistic streak a mile wide. If you ever want to call me, I'll be in the book, but I'm never home, so don't bother to look. If you come hunting me, I got lots of places to hide. So darling, I'll be leaving now. I would have made you happy if I just knew how. The time is past for trying, ain't no use you crying, 'cause darling, I'm leaving now. Darling, I'm leaving now. Well, I'm sure glad there ain't no alimony involved. So you got all my things packed. How about my brand new Tony Lama boots? Kiss your what? Does anybody know the meaning of the word procrastination? I looked it up in a dictionary. It's a pretty big word. And I found out that I'm quite familiar with the meaning of it. Not that I've ever had any experience myself, but just studying others who have the problem. I wrote a poem called Procrastination. It goes like this. This morning just passed, I woke up and asked myself, with this life I've been living's been leading. The horse of desire could use some new fire. The cows of ambition some feeding. My back is sore, my eyes are poor, seems old age is beginning to find me. And if the end isn't near, well, it's abundantly clear there's sure less time ahead than behind me. Now I've been thinking I should get down the trail and pick up my mail. I just can't seem to make up my mind. Should I drive? Should I ride? See, it's kind of hard to decide when you're of the procrastinate kind. I got a good horse outside, and sure, I suppose I could still crawl his hide if I could just make up my mind to get to it. I got a truck with new tires, but then when my license expired, I never did quite get around to renew it. Now you see, my problem is that sometimes the Mounties will wait just past my gate to see if they can catch me a-doing something wrong. As for that horse, well, I fear he ain't been under his gear for what just might be a little too long. So if I drive down the trail, I could end up in jail. If I ride, I could end up in traction, because that cayuse can fire when he gets the desire. And I'm afraid I may be a few years past that kind of action. So it would seem it's the risk to my frame or to my good name. Because if I go to jail, folks will sure talk. But sure as I'm sitting here, one thing's perfectly clear. I sure as hell ain't going to walk. Now when I first started this ponder, I gazed off over yonder, where the morning sun had just risen. And now, as it slips out of sight, the oncoming night means I won't have to make the decision.
Now, a lot of cowboys, when they're in their younger years, they get involved with the sport of rodeo, and I was no exception. I got on quite a few horses, and I used to travel with a fellow by the name of Delmer, and he was about 10 years older than me, and he'd kind of taken me under his wing, trying to make a bronc rider out of me with limited success. But he was a good bronc rider, and when I traveled with him, I kind of felt important, especially when we went to these little small town backwoods rodeos we used to refer to as pumpkin rollers. And you know, I'd feel pretty important walking into town at those rodeos because I was with Dahmer, and I have no doubt that I had developed a bit of a strut, and I was probably a cowboy who was badly in need of a lesson in humility. And that came one day, courtesy of a horse with quite a bit of talent, very little desire to please, and absolutely no sense of humor. You see, I'd heard a lot of stories, songs, and poems where great bronc rides were the theme, where the horse kicked holes in the sky while the cowboy sat him clean. It was either to a standstill or to the old 10-second horn. And it was then they'd say things like, "Cowboys can't be made, they must be born." Well, I've seen my share of good rides and perhaps even made a few. But there's a more neglected subject I'd like to share with you. It's about those times that we've all seen when, for reasons not quite clear, the ride was not completed, though the effort seemed sincere. When the cowboy's skill and courage, though never much in doubt, was not quite enough to keep him from too early checking out. When the cards were well played, but still the bronc first saw, then raised the hand, and left the hapless cowboy scouting out a place to land. Now, one such event that comes to mind involved a horse called Ben. A small town rodeo, some whiskey, myself, and an old friend. We'd come to make some easy cash at this little backwoods town and being some cocky without a thought of ever bucking down. There was one horse my old friend informed me could just give us some concern. He was rank and his name just might be Ben was all that he could learn. Well, sure enough, when the draw was posted, there was Ben's name right next to mine. Seems I'd topped the herd at this pumpkin roller. To me, that sat just fine. Now, I usually weren't a man to drink and ride. That never seemed to pay, but somehow these backwoods boys had a way of making no thanks hard to say. And so it was, with half a quart of whiskey neath my belt, I stalked the chute to screw my rig down on Ben's dusty pelt. Well, he stood real quiet as I haltered him and measured out my rein. When the saddle and the flank arrived, he acted much the same. He gave a little flinch as I pulled my cinch, but it was hardly worth a mention. It was right about then, I guess, I should have started paying more attention. See, I'd been around long enough to know to give those quiet kind their due, but ain't it funny how the whiskey'll sometimes talk to you? Right then it was telling me I could ride anything with hair. So I just hopped aboard and bobbed my head. Well, she was all downhill from there. See, there was this spruce rail crossbar with a number nailed to it high above the chute. On the first jump, it took my hat off, and a little hide to boot. I lost my swells, and as the daylight grew between me and the seat, I must confess I was concerned. But then he kicked and set my feet. Well, judging by that first jump, old Ben was doing his part, and hey, I was back in shape and off to what I thought a decent start. Now the second jump was stouter yet, and it was then it first occurred to me. I just might be overmounted. Then came jump number 3. Well, now there weren't much doubt about it, because as I looked down in front of me, I noticed that his ass was where his head was supposed to be. Well, it was clear the ride was over. It was time to pull the pin. But, you know, it really kind of bothered me just how quick I'd been done in. As I picked myself up off the ground, it was clear for all to see. I'd been bested fair and square. But then an idea came to me. Perhaps these rubes they had for judges weren't too familiar with the rules. Maybe I could con me a rewrite from the fools. So I walked right up to the nearest one. I said, "Say, I was fouled by that there horse, and I demand a rewrite." On a different bronc, of course. Well, I guess it should have tipped me off when his face took on that grin, and he said, "Why, sure, son, go get your rig while we run another in." Now, back behind the chute, my old friend and me were doing our best to hide our laughter at how I'd conned my way around that horse I couldn't ride. Just then, a local twister come up to jaw with us. The talk soon centered on that horse who just put me in the dust. We both said, and quite sincerely, that famous horse called Ben sure ain't no fake. The cowboy looked confused and said, "There must be some mistake. The horse with the reputation is not the colt called Ben. It's his much ranker older brother, and he's in the reride pen." The fellow I was with on that day, as I mentioned earlier, was a fellow by the name of Delmer. And as is often the case with those type of guys who, they seem indestructible, but as sadly is often the case, they kind of, if they don't die young, they tend to kind of fade away, and it's a sad thing to see. And I was thinking about him, and I'd heard some stuff about him, and he was in a senior's home somewhere, and I was going to go visit him, and I thought, you know, I should probably just try and remember him the way he was. And I ended up writing this song about him. It's called Delmer. He was the kind of cowboy we won't see again. Like the freedom that was all he could abide. Friends, he knew a few, I'm proud he called me one. All agreed he sure as hell could ride. A bit more than a kid I was when he took me neath his wing and did his best to teach me what he knew. Spider in his rigging, caution to the wind, damn near got me killed a time or two. Spurring high and wild, I thought he was immortal. I didn't see it ending up this way. I guess I knew he could die young, I just didn't need to know that in time he could just quietly fade away. We rode the small town rodeos, we rode the big stampede. raised a little hell along the way. We never did quite make the fast lane. I guess it didn't mean enough. We'd always live to fight another day. It was that high, lonesome feeling that kept me by his side, till I reached for it one day and it was gone. I waved goodbye to Delmer as he rode off in the sunset, and I went chasing rainbows with a song. Spurring high and wild, I thought he was immortal. I didn't see it ending up this way. I guess I knew he could die young. I just didn't need to know that in time he could just quietly fade away. Small town Saskatchewan, fighting borrowed time. The senior's home, a room just down the hall. An old cowboy sits quietly staring out the window. I guess Delmer weren't immortal after all. But spurring high and wild, he sure looked to be. I didn't see it ending up this way. I guess I knew he could die young. I just didn't need to know that in time he could just quietly fade away. Spurring high and wild, God, he looked immortal. I didn't see it ending up this way. I always knew he could die young. Somehow I just ain't quite ready to sit and watch him quietly fade away. We get asked often, like, what is cowboy poetry? And there's all kinds of different answers to it. One might be it's about cowboys by cowboys. It's not necessarily so. There's so many different ways of answering the question that I ended up writing this song, which is kind of my answer to what is cowboy poetry. And it's called The Cowboy Poet. Got a full-time job, turning down work he ain't got time to do. When he tells a lie, everybody knows it's just a little bit true. He's a slave to tradition, and at times to foolish pride. But if anybody said he ain't real, they lie. He'll say his truck's got lots of ponies underneath the hood, and the loop he's always been out of shakes out real good. For heading off destruction, a heel and a bump steer. Still every now and then he'll shed a tear. He's a cowboy on a mission, a preacher in disguise. He's got just one ambition, that he can put you wise to that fine old tradition born in days gone by. He ain't quite truth, but he ain't quite lie. find him in the pump houses, you'll find him in the bars, you'll find him round the campfires underneath the stars. His message is delivered in meter and in rhyme. A good laugh cures lonesome every time. He's a cowboy on a mission, a preacher in disguise. He's got just one ambition, that he can put you wise to that fine old tradition, born of days gone by. He ain't quite truth, but he ain't quite lie. Perhaps one day the world will realize he's more than just the diamond on a pack of flies. You may not understand him or even know the reason why. He can make you laugh or he can make you cry. He's a cowboy on a mission, a preacher in disguise. He's got just one ambition, that he can put you wise to that fine old tradition, born of days gone by. He ain't quite truth, but he ain't quite lie. He ain't quite truth, but he ain't quite lie. But he can make you laugh, or he can make you cry. People have asked me what connection I have with cowboy life today, and whether the cowboy ways are still alive. Well, I live in the same yard as a fellow by the name of Dick Winters, and he's a fellow poet and a fellow cowboy. And I get hydro and all the grass-fed beef and garden vegetables I can eat. In return for that, I help him out with his cows, calving in the spring, and break a horse or two once in a while. And one of the other things we do is in the winter we feed cows with a team and a bale sled. Now, of course, it's Dick's team and it's Dick's place and it's Dick's cows, so Dick gets to be the boss, which means Dick also gets to be the teamster, which means I get to do everything else. That means opening gates, running the hoist, cutting the twines. Now, anyone who's ever cut and pulled the twines off of large round bales at 40 below, particularly those kind of bales that have been sitting on the ground a little too long and have what Dick so colorfully describes as that 3.5 feet of Siberian pavement cemented to one side of them. Anyone who's ever done this job won't be surprised to learn that I was always looking for new ways to make my job a little easier, trying to come up with new ideas. And I'd often share these ideas with Dick, and Dick's response would usually be something like, "Oh boy, that's sure a stupid idea, that'll never work." And one day I got kind of tired of hearing this, so I decided that I came up with what I thought was a real good idea for taking the twine off a large round bale. And I decided I'm not going to tell Dick about it. I'm just going to wait till the appropriate moment, and then I'm going to put it into practice. And that's what I did. And things didn't go quite according to plan, but actually that's a good thing because it makes a better poem that way. Now, before I do this poem, I've got to put a little disclaimer on it, like you do in front of, they do on television shows where they say, this movie has graphic violence, nudity, and coarse language. Now, this poem doesn't have any of those things, but it does make a rather less than flattering reference to Dick's Mennonite heritage. And I just want to assure everybody that I in no way mean to cast aspersions on Mennonites in general, but only Dick in particular. Now, feeding cows in winter ain't a job for every man. Most cowboys I know will avoid it if they can. The skills required are simple: a strong back, a weak mind. Though a tolerance for cold and a sense of humor just might help from time to time. Now, a team and a bale sled is how we feed these days, preferred over what some may consider more enlightened ways. Now, Dick, he's boss and teamster. His hands never leave the lines. My job is run the hoist, open gates, and cut the twines. Now, this last aspect of my job has been a topic of debate during supper conversation, designed to irritate. That ideal never worked. Don't ask me how I know. I've cut and pulled 1,000,000 twines. Believe me when I say it's so. Well, I got to wondering why I should be the target of abuse just for trying to simplify the job and put our time to better use. So one day I decided I'd just show what I could do. I'd remove that twine in one piece. What happened next, I swear is true. My plan was simple, and I was sure that nothing could go wrong. I just rolled that twine off, opposite the way it was rolled on. Now, our team comprised a gelding, a steady puller for his size, and by his side a mare well matched, but not partial to surprise. As that bale rolled out, I hung on tight to the loose end of the twine, and from where I stood, at first it looked like things were going fine. But before that bale was half unstrung, the hay began to fly, a sight going not unnoticed by that mare's unblinkered eye. Well, now that team was off and running across that field of frozen turds, and no Christian should be witness to the language that I heard. Like a symphony of banging runners and hoofbeats in full flight, accompanying the lyrics of that cursing Mennonite. Well, the whole outfit then disappeared into a cloud of flying hay, and just how it all stayed upright is a mystery to this day. As for reasons I still have a job, there are two that come to mind. Dick has a sense of humor, and cheap help is hard to find.
I'd like to do a poem now. This is a poem that there's a lot of Christianity in amongst the cowboy culture these days, and they have cowboy churches and so on like that. And it's kind of a non-denominational thing. Pretty much, as long as you're a kind of a Christian, you can get involved in it. And this is a poem I wrote about. It's about a dream I had, and it's one I sure won't forget. In it, I met a stranger. I can see him yet. Mounted on that big rank stud, 3 wild-eyed broncs in tow. The packs they wore looked heavy, and I just had to know. So I asked him where it was he's headed. He responded with a smile, said he'd tell me all about it if I'd ride with him a while. Well, we rode for miles on a level trail that flanked the valley floor. He talked about the weather, but not a whole lot more. He seemed to be preoccupied with things going on around. A furtive glance, a careful study for sign upon the ground. As dusk approached, that trail turned sharp, straight up the mountainside. Sure looked to me to be a place no mortal man could ride. I suggested we unpack and camp as it was coming night. All he said was, best snug the diamonds and pull our riggings tight. For that's a nasty climb we have ahead, and we're running out of day. You'll have to take my word for it. This ain't no place to stay. Well, that stallion must have been half goat the way he scrambled up that scree, and the equal of those 3 under pack I know I'll never see. What it looked to me to be a most intimidating slope, that stranger and his pack string were taken at a lope. And hey, after all, it was a dream, so I was equally well mounted. On a horse with all the right stuff, exactly where it counted. As we reached the upper timber and the trees began to thin, I reined my horse in for a rest and to look back where we'd been. What I saw down there had me wanting bad to climb up even higher. That valley we just rode through had somehow turned to fire. But what was really making my skin crawl the way the sight of blowfly maggots often will was what I saw and heard along our back trail, right where it cut straight up the hill. Like some surly blue-tick coon dog on a dank and musky trail was the devil, every jump or two, letting out a wail. I heard the stranger holler, "Don't show him any face, it's Satan, he struck our trail. There ain't no time to waste." Well, that trail kept getting steeper and our mounts began to fail as their sharp-shod hooves kept scratching for some grip beneath the shale. That stallion slipped and skidded, and that poor trio under pack would gain a step ahead, then lose two sliding back. Well, don't ask me how we done it, but we made it up into the rocks, where the stranger pulled the stallion up and then began to talk. "We got that devil beat for now. We can rest here for a spell. He'll squall and beller for a while, then head straight back to hell. He won't come up above the trees where there ain't no place to hide. He knows too well these misty slopes where God still likes to ride." Well, what I needed now was answers, and commenced to ask for some. I didn't have too long to wait till they began to come. The stranger said, "I'll fill you in, but before we get too far, allow me to say a word about just where it is we are. These barren slopes are virtue, God's heavenly domain. That lush green valley is temptation, the devil's only game." Well, by now the stud had settled and quit pawing at the ground, and the stranger went to making introductions all around. He said, "I'd like you to meet my pack string, and let me tell you something of the burdens that they bear, and why without 'em you sure won't find me a-going anywhere. This first horse here is Faith, sometimes known as just Believin'. He'll help you through life's valleys and the steep ravines of grievin'. But with his panniers filled with doubt and fear and a top pack of deceit, I must confess, I often wonder just how he keeps his feet. Now, tale to him is humility. He'll sometimes fight his head. That devil on our back trail would sure love to see him dead. He's packing lots of vanity, pride, and a little superstition, a top pack of conceit beneath a mantle of ambition. Now, this last mare here is Honesty. I still like her the best. She's the one I'll often bell just so I can find the rest. Beneath her tarp is envy, greed, and a host of other sin. It requires the longest lash rope just to hold the crap all in. Well, I suppose by now you're wondering just how a buckaroo like me has come to own a string as fine as the stallion in these three. Well, truth be known, they ain't mine. I'm just leasing them from God. But come time to do the packing, well, the devil got that job. He got to fill those boxes with the evils of his choice. So when you're riding through temptation and on your back trail hear his voice, know he'd love to cut the lash and slings and set those demons free. So lay on spurs for that awful trail that leads above the trees. For the upper slopes of virtue are the only place to hide. Till the word comes from the summit, it's time to make that final ride. This is I'd like to do a modern technology is something that's really it's been an aid and it's really made the world a different place, and cowboys are no exception. They've been affected by it too, but sometimes it can have a negative effect when it clashes with the old ways, and that's what this poem's about. It's called The Bridge. The cowboy of old lived a tough life, it said. One little mistake could soon find him dead. like a pedal hung foot while taking a spill or some salty bronc slip on an icy side hill. There were stampeding cattle, prairie fires gone wild. Winter's too cold, summer's too mild. There was fever and blizzards. They all took their toll on the cowboy's body, perhaps even his soul. You could live high, then die, all in the same day. Just why so many stayed with it ain't easy to say. But you know, for those few who today still ride the range, the risk is still there. So many of the hazards have changed. As an example of this, a wreck comes to mind, of late endured by an old friend of mine. My friend's name is Dick Winters, and one day Dick was headed for home. On a horse, just for rhyme's sake, we'll call Mr. Roan. Now, he'd been breaking the colt and figured things were going okay, and they had plenty of trail behind them that day, when they came upon a water-filled ditch. Now, Dick could see to cross it most places would be a real bitch. There was 2 feet of water above at least that much mud. Even on a broke horse, it would prove a tough slug. And so, as Dick surveyed the scene from a nearby ridge, he was quite pleased to spot that old timber bridge. Now, it spanned the ditch about 6 feet high. It was weathered and gray, but seemed sound enough to the eye. Of course, to Mr. Roan, bridges were something brand new. So when his front feet hit them planks, he snorted and blew. Dick figured, hey, what better time to bridge break the colt? So he just turned out his toes and gave him a poke. The roan jumped aboard, seeing he knew who was boss, and in no time at all, they were halfway across. Now, Dick had his hands full for sure, but he figured he could get that roan through if he could just hold them together for another minute or two. Well, it was right then they both heard it. That twittering rattle. It was the cell phone hanging from the back of his saddle. What a hell of a time to get a phone call. Seems the roan agreed and let out a bawl. Then he dropped his head and started to pitch. And in no time they were both upside down in the ditch. Well, Dick busted 3 ribs and damn nearly drowned. But he's tough and managed to drag himself back to high ground. He looked all over for any sign of that roan, but I guess by then that cayuse was halfway home. But you know, Dick could still hear the twitter of that damn cell phone bell as it rang again and again from right there where it fell. He picked it up and all he said was, "What?" It was Dick's wife on the other end who started to talk. "You were on a green colt. It's getting on towards night. I just called to make sure that you were all right." Now, the irony wasn't lost on Dick. He still loves a good joke. But you know, these days, all Dick's horses are cell phone broke.